Hello! This essay has been in progress for a pretty long time. Almost a year, actually. So long, in fact, that I've already presented it in talk format twice now. And doing those talks have made me come to this original script and need to tweak it. So there will be some continuity errors between filming, audio, etc. And yeah, that's why. This is all for a better essay though, and I hope that it's not too distracting. Also, as a content warning, this essay is going to discuss some pretty deep subjects such as racism, misogyny, and brief discussions of essay, and we'll have some pretty grisly imagery throughout, as it should. Thank you, and enjoy the video. So, before I properly begin this essay, I come to the floor with a question. Fellas, have you ever wanted to bite your partner? Whether that be the non-gender specific urge to bite or the hidden sixth love language biting, according to a legion of TikTok videos, tweets, and, let's be honest, the best social platform, Tumblr posts, this is pretty standard thinking. Vice News journalist Danny Rand took the time to consider this further in the aptly titled piece, Why Do I Always Want to Bite the Person I Love? Writing that when that being affection for their partner, arises, intense feelings of adoration, delight, and confusion normally race through my body. Biting offers me the somatic, meaning the physical desire, release that I desperately crave. She also consulted with Dr. Oriana Aragon's research into dimorphous expressions, which connects the desire to bite your loved one to a super strong urge that you just need to express, and then you do the bite, and it helps you to cleanse yourself and cope with those feelings. According to Dr. Aragon's research, 50 to 60% of people actually experience these intense expressions of love and fondness. So again, it's pretty standard thinking. We bite the ones we love, just like we see a picture of a puppy or a baby and express our adoration for it by wanting to eat them, bite them. You're so cute, I could just eat you up. It's not actual aggression, you're not going to do those things, just intense feelings of adoration all coming out at once. Cute aggression. But have you ever wanted to go further than that? Have you ever wanted to go further than just biting? Have you ever wanted to rupture skin, to taste blood, to feel splintering bone and pulsing muscle as your teeth sink into the flesh of the one you love the most and feel them on your tongue as you swallow them down? Have you ever wanted them to do the same to you? For them to devour you, to be nourished by your body, to carry you with them always, inside of them, a part of them, to never let them go? Have you ever wanted to eat? If so, you may be interested in what I have to say. Let's talk cannibalism. To give a broad definition and to typify exactly what we're talking about here, cannibalism is the act of humans eating other humans, whether that be organs, flesh, or the whole plate. Originally derived from Spanish cannibal or carabal, originally used as name for the Caribs, a people from the West Indies said to have eaten human flesh, Shirley Lindenbaum suggests that it may be better to talk about cannibalisms in the plural, as there are many ways that the practice of cannibalism is recognised worldwide. Generically speaking though, most acts of cannibalism are distinguished into three key types. Institutionalized cannibalism, meaning cannibalism as a learned cultural or religious practice, survival cannibalism, or cannibalism to stave off starvation and hunger, or cannibalism as psychopathology or apparent behaviour, cannibalism as a criminal or pathological act. But I'm not so interested in talking about actual acts of cannibalism. If I was, I would have kept going to therapy. So I'm more interested in thinking about how cannibalism is used in the horror genre. Before I go into this essay's main topic, anyway.
Though written depictions of cannibalism have existed in literary fiction since Greek epic poetry and Shakespeare in the Middle Ages, who particularly utilised criminal and another type not defined, accidental cannibalism, like in the end of Titus Andronicus, where its title character kills the queen's sons and feeds them to her, and elements of cannibalism were certainly implied in early cinema, with the earliest example of cannibalism on film appearing to be The Enchanted Kiss from 1917, the actual subject and graphic visual depiction of cannibalism didn't really make its break into film until the 70s, specifically with Italian films like Man from Deep River, Emmanuel and the Last Cannibals, and The Mountain of the Cannibal God, all of which depicted the act of institutionalized cannibalism as a learned practice, often by the natives of foreign countries. Cannibal Holocaust is perhaps the film which typified the Italian cannibalism film the most for American audiences, though, by depicting a white film crew from New York travelling to the Amazon rainforest to film a documentary on cannibalistic tribes with, well, incredibly grisly results.
Though not to downplay the well-deserved controversies and criticisms of this film due to its graphic depictions of sexual assault and actual IRL depictions of animal death, Cannibal Holocaust Legacy is an incredibly important one for the horror genre, partly due to its depictions of cannibalism, but also due to its mondo/found footage filmmaking style, going on to inspire films like The Blair Witch Project and an entire genre of found footage horror films.
William Ahrens writes that cannibalism functions as a mythical device to separate civilized Western man from his barbaric foreign cousins. It incites innate disgust and is a potent means to designate the accused as subhuman. Where this initial argument is based on the distinctly racial readings of institutionalized cannibalism within these texts, apt considering the origin of the word cannibalism has its roots in Spanish colonialism, I would argue that we can extend this concept even further and apply it to the space of anyone that we deem as other, to quote Robin Wood's theories on the monstrous other in the horror genre, meaning that we can depict cannibalism being enacted by anyone, from the impoverished and working class rednecks to the very most upper class, from men, women, straights and gays. I mean, what unites every person on the planet? We all need to eat, and we're all going to die.
I would therefore like to establish a kind of binary between depictions of cannibalism on screen. A binary that encompasses the three types outlined by Lindenbaum, the first being entirely consumptive, and the other being eminently romantic.
Silas Denver then writes that the cannibal exists in two extremes. One for the depravity of it, and one for the sacredness of the mouth. The brute cannibal, already outcasted by society, wants nothing more than the sick satisfaction of enacting a taboo. The other cannibal, however, is the one that is good at mercy, takes the flesh between the fingers, not for the shock of the audience, but because they cannot stand the separation.
Because they can occupy the space of two different extremes, of both horror and violence, the depravity, and sacred romanticism, the sacredness of the mouth, the cannibal may therefore exist as a uniquely queered Gothic figure within the horror genre, a true representative of literary liminality between horror and romance, rich and poor, living and dead, eater and eaten. So today I'm going to be examining the romantic cannibal as it is specifically depicted in Eckhard Schmidt's Der Fan, Luca Guadagnino's Bones and All, and Ethel Keynes's Preacher's Daughter, and how the figure of the cannibal pervades as an intimately queered figure of Gothic Americana, while also seeking to define how the cannibal and the act of cannibalism can be read as explicitly romantic. And before we get into case studies, let's define our binary. First, the consumptive, the brute cannibal, the depravity of it.
When considering the ethics and indeed the logistics of cannibalism, Amanda Stern writes that cannibalism is not a taboo because it's inherently unhealthy, it is because we don't want people regarding us as food. We don't want ourselves or our children to be the person eaten. This depiction of cannibalism, the depravity of it, that we saw in the early Italian cannibal films and continue to see in franchises like Hannibal and others, focuses on the understandable horror of cannibalism. cannibalism, often emphasising the violence invoked by the cannibal, the horror of people regarding us as food, while also depicting the gruesome and often invasive death, dismemberment and preparation of the human body to be properly rendered as food. This suggests a cannibalism that is not so reverent of the human body, but one that sees one life as greater than the others, like livestock.
Whenever feasible, one should always try to eat the root. Would you join me at the table?
More often than not, this depiction is pathological, or cannibalism as a criminal practice and a compulsive one at that. But again, institutionalised cannibalism, cannibalism as cultural practice, is a frequent trope too, generally taking the institutional cannibal away from the practices of indigenous tribes and placing them in the more familiar and desolate American or Western landscape, thus increasing the fear in the Western audience due to the familiarity of the setting and effectively de-othering the perpetrator. In terms of racial politics anyway. I'm sure it comes as no shock to consider the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as an example of consumptive cannibalism, with its depictions of the human body as nothing more than meat, but I would be remiss to not mention others such as The Hills Have Eyes, August Underground, and Wrong Turn 2. This iteration of cannibalism on screen quite often has its sociological roots in anti-capitalist sentiments, criticising a society that forces its most vulnerable into acts of cannibalism and viewing the body as nothing more than a monetary commodity, something to be bought and sold, a dish on the table, a body in a seat. Like much anti-capitalist horror to nod towards class theory in the contemporary horror landscape, consumptively cannibalistic films pose the question, how much is a body, a life worth, when it is being regarded as food?
The popular splatterpunk book, Tender is the Flesh, tackles this subject head-on by depicting a slaughterhouse owner who navigates the nauseating and openly traumatizing task of killing human livestock after animals are collectively wiped out. Tender is the Flesh brings about its own questions about neoliberal capitalism and industrialised farming, particularly through the depiction of characters called savages, people who cannot afford the high-priced human livestock and eat whatever dead bodies they can find, putting themselves in danger due to a society that has largely failed them, while also ravaging graveyards for the taste of human meat and no longer seeing them as human beings.
In reference to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, many cultural critics have written of the film as being inherently anti-capitalist too, and importantly, explicitly critical of a concept called Pax Americana, which I covered extensively in my first horror musical essay, and the kinds of lifestyles that other media at the time was celebrating. Instead, Chainsaw, and many films that came after it, depicts characters, specifically the Sawyer family, who were seeking the idyllic, patriarchal and capitalist lifestyle that once supported their slaughter and meat business, which reflects or corresponds to the established or interdependent American institution, despite how significantly that very system ultimately abandoned and failed them, forcing them into acts of cannibalism as a means of supporting themselves and their family.
Is now a good time to mention I'm a vegetarian? Because surely you just go vegetarian in this case, right? But of course, the cannibal is not exclusively motivated by desperation and poor living situations, no. If that was the case, we'd be having a cannibalistic epidemic amidst the cost of living crisis. No, more often than not, the act of cannibalism is often rooted in an urge and pursuit of power, and heavily politicised power dynamics too, exemplified in what the earlier cited Lindenbaum writes as exocannibalism, an act of aggression often in the context of warfare, where the flesh of killed or captured enemies may be eaten to celebrate one's victory over them. Those outside of the group are other, and therefore a threat on the power that those inside the group have, whether that be in the small community of desolate Texas or society as a whole. We do be living in one.
It's worth noting that the Sawyers probably don't see their victims as all they're human, similarly to the society of Tender is the Flesh breeding human livestock. They're animals in their own right. In contrast to, say, the aristocratic Hannibal Lecter, who recognises the humanity of his victims and enjoys it all the more because of that, or in Mimi Cave's Fresh in 2022, in which Sebastian Stan plays a very problematically handsome and wealthy cannibal named Steve, who kidnaps and dismembers girls to share the pleasure of eating flesh with the similarly rich and upper class. It's not enough to just kill someone, you eat them too, to prove that you are ultimately better than they are. You are the eater, not the eaten. Indeed, and to quote Carolyn Bynum, to eat was a powerful verb. It meant to consume, to assimilate, to become God. And if we're talking about power dynamics, this iteration of cannibalism is often very gendered too. Fresh is all about specifically men eating specifically women.
Tender as the Flesh's protagonist literally impregnates a piece of female livestock gifted to him by a wealthy buyer, with both of these texts being written by women.
And the subject of Chainsaw's gendered violence has inspired feminist critiques of the horror genre since its release.
There's also frequent depictions of sexual violence with this iteration of cannibalism too, as represented as early as Cannibal Holocaust, due in part to the cannibal's perception of the body, often female, but not always, as lesser than, and therefore worthy of violation at its very darkest. As unfortunate and frankly unnecessary as these scenes often are, it does bring to mind the fears associated with cannibalism which were depicted in the times of the Gothic literary movement, and indeed some of the discussions that I will be talking about later. This lends me well to discussing the counter and the bulk of this essay, the sacredness of the mouth and cannibalism as an eminently romantic act. While the academic zeitgeist is only just now waking up to the idea of cannibalism as being a romantic act, the depiction of cannibalism as being explicitly romantic actually has its roots in Gothic literature, as many things do within the horror genre.
Much like Lindenbaum's cannibalisms, as earlier discussed, the Gothic had many different approaches to depicting the cannibal, be that metaphorical in Wuthering Heights, with being described with sharp cannibal teeth revealed by cold and wrath, gleaming through the dark, or auto-cannibalism in Robinson Crusoe, with its protagonist spotting the basin in which was the blood I had bled at my nose, and running to it and swallowing it with such haste and greedy appetite. Elizabeth Andrews cites cannibalistic depictions in the Gothic as being representative of the emaciated female body and excessive and metaphorical male consumption of these more vulnerable bodies, and there is certainly validity to that reading, especially in the context of the female Gothic literature as being a preeminent space to examine the fears of women. Still, I'd like to posit a slightly different reading, a reading as suggested in the final acts of interestingly queer cannibalism shared between two dying lovers in Melmoth the Wanderer, or cannibalism as an act of love. Eating and being eaten belonged to the terrible secret of love. We love only the person we can eat. While Helene Cizot is of course suggesting this metaphorical devouring of those you love, the horror genre offers the opportunity to read this and depictions within the genre, both literary and cinematically, as a sort of monstrously elevated love language, as suggested in the beginning of this essay. The yearning to bite and tear into your partner as an intimate act of love. And it kind of is an act of love. Devouring your loved one to always have a part of them with you, to never be apart from them. Biting down to feel how real they are between your teeth. An intercourse of torment and hostility in the best possible way. Poppy Z. Bright's novel Exquisite Corpse, self-described as a necrophilic, cannibalistic, serial killer love story that explores the seamy politics of victimhood and disease, revolves around the ideas of death and violence as a precursor for sex and romance, depicting two serial killers, Andrew Compton and Jay Byrne, falling in love in the South and planning the perfect murder together after finding one another amidst their sordid desires.
And after its gory climax that leads with their perfect victim and Jay dead, Andrew finds solace in knowing that he will always carry his lover with him after cannibalizing his corpse.
I wanted only to keep Jay's meat in me as long as I could, to process and assimilate as much of him as possible. When I awoke, he would be with me always, and all the world's pleasures would be ours to revel in. This time, I was not corpse, but lava. Beautiful. Beautiful. I swear, I'm going to write an entire essay just about Poppy Z. Bright's prose because, beautiful. To interject on the subject of the queer cannibal, David Bergman recounts, after being prompted from a student on whether or not cannibalistic fantasies were common in gay literature, although my initial reaction was no, I realised that I could cite a half-dozen examples off the top of my head. Indeed, Bergman seemingly came to the conclusion, as I have via the initial yearning to bite and interest in the subject, that the entanglement of cannibalism and homosexuality is far from an anomaly and may, in fact, represent an important facet of what he terms gay rhetoric, a case of gay male reclamation.
And this isn't exclusively a subject confined to horror either.
You want to play Bitey?
Indeed, in hit HBO show Succession, and sorry for talking about Succession in a video about horror, something for the non-horror fans, I guess. In the midst of their divorce in the final season of the show, often unhappy but generally lovable married couple, Tom Wamsgans and Shiv Roy, are able to romantically and sexually reconnect through a game of bitey, biting down on each other's arms in the middle of a crowded party and waiting to see who will relent first. It's really a scene that just says so much about their characters. Shiv's need to assert some degree of power over Tom in spite of her ultimate lack of power, and Tom's reluctant, albeit successful consumption of Shiv, alluding to his eventual victory over the Roy family as a whole. It's just perfect. And as Megan O'Keefe writes, the weirdest, grossest, and most sexually in sync Tom and Shiv have ever been.
Despite what they've gone through and how they will end, they are still desirous of each other. They still want to feel each other. But, due in part to the constant pursuit of power from both characters and the present power dynamics that permeate the show and their relationship, that desire can only be realised through cannibalistic violence. Also, Matthew McFadden is like the pioneer of touch as a love language, so it only makes sense that he carries out this one too. And just like love, cannibalism is complicated. It has teeth which bite and the wounds never close. Maybe you only realise your feelings for a guy after you've obsessed about eating him for 3 seasons of television, and then you eat a different guy together to realise that love. Or maybe your story is a thinly veiled werewolf metaphor about coming of age and sexual agency and wanting to eat people. And maybe your sister too. Maybe the cute guy you met at the grocery store runs a cannibalistic version of HelloFresh and just might choose to eat you in a different way if you behave really, really well, with all of the power dynamics that accompany that too. Or maybe you realise that you were in love with your childhood best friend, only after she dies and you eat her corpse.
While I've established these two distinctions, depravity and sacredness, cannibalism isn't necessarily exclusively consumptive, nor is it necessarily exclusively romantic. There's an awful lot of power behind love, after all, and arguably a lot of love behind certain renditions of power. The binary isn't exclusively binary, and have a tendency to blur and shift and complicate distinctions, which I suppose leads me to discuss my case studies.
Der Fan is a 1982 West German horror film directed by Eckhard Schmidt, which follows a teenage girl, Simone, and her obsessive love for a pop singer named R. Simone is kind of a proto-fandom girly. She does nothing else but listen to R's music and write him fan letters, daydreams about him while she's supposed to be studying, and yells at her parents when they try to turn off his shows. She's easily someone I would follow on Stan Twitter, basically. Eventually, her unrequited obsessions becomes too much for her to handle on her own, and she just has to meet R and profess her love for him. She hitchhikes across the city to attend a recording of one of his shows, almost getting sexually assaulted on the way over, and because he's a man in show business with a little too much of an ego and power over women, R takes an instant liking to her. The two go back to his place and have sex, but when she tells Simone to go home, she realises that he doesn't feel the same way for her that she does for him. He's just another guy using her for his own benefit. So she naturally kills him, dismembers and freezes his body, and eats his corpse.
We've all been there, right? It's unsurprising that Der Fan was recommended to me after I presented the first phase of this research last year. Simone is a textbook lovesick fangirl, eating the person she admires and quote-unquote loves more than anything to always have a piece of him with her in spite of his abuse. But watching the film, I was quite struck by how significantly it replicates my earlier discussions regarding power and power dynamics between men and women, and the reinterpretation of gendered violence in the horror genre. To discuss a running subject that I'm going to very, very simply refer to as girl cannibalism and boy cannibalism, or the differences between women and men being the perpetrators of cannibalistic violence, since I haven't seen any non-binary cannibals just yet, I think now is a good time to discuss the specific politics of female eaters for a moment. Be they eaters of human bodies, or, just regular eaters.
Female eating is so heavily politicised, so much so that it's considered a radical act to make a film about a woman just enjoying food. Think Eat, Pray, Love, or the scene of Carrie and Miranda eating cupcakes from Magnolia Bakery in another HBO hit, Sex and the City. And that's mostly down to the gendered power dynamics established by patriarchy, so it's no wonder that the female cannibal is such an evocative figure within the horror genre.
Reflecting on the subject of the monstrous feminine, a theory posited by Barbara Creed, Megan Kenny writes, "When women are portrayed as cannibals, disgust is twofold. The cultural consumption of women's bodies through gender-based violence, capitalism and objectification means that women are positioned as the eaten rather than the eater. The female cannibal, with her associated violence, is able to transgress these cultural and moral boundaries which disrupts the system."
I think this is worth discussing, especially when the very origin of cannibalism is so rooted in the othering of marginalised bodies. And while it's certainly not lost on me that the female cannibals discussed through this essay are almost universally depicted as stick-thin and conventionally pretty, though I think it's fair to chalk that up to the general lack of fat bodies in film as a whole, I think it's still worth considering how political cannibalism is, and remains to be within the subject of gendered discourse.
Returning back to Der Fan, it's difficult to ignore the fact that Simone is quite clearly a teenage girl, and is in fact played by one, making her extended nude and sex scenes with the assertively adult R quite uncomfortable to watch. R sees her as little more than another woman to conquer, a sexual object on which to assert his power, thus emphasising the significant power dynamics between the two characters, and bringing to mind the common discussions we now have in the space of #MeToo, famous men taking advantage of women and girls. Simone's vulnerability is constantly emphasised through the film. She has always been spoken to by men with power over her, teachers, government workers, television staff, and R himself. And after R has sex with her, she cautiously steps through his house in the nude while he is fully dressed, looming over her. Perhaps Simone's killing of R is meant to be interpreted as a reclamation of her power under patriarchy, power that she lost in her obsession and the attempted assault before he even met her. He took something from her due to his need for power, so she takes something from him, and moreover consumes him entirely to assert herself as more powerful and stronger than him. She is the eater, and not him. Der Fan also has a lot to say about fandom and fan culture. Simone's motivations for meeting R are based solely on fantasy, a fantasy of Technicolor and scored by German New Wave. And so one might argue that when R doesn't live up to that fantasy, revealing himself to be just another man using her, she feels betrayed and a degree of ownership over this fantasy he unconsciously created for her, and claims him completely to fulfill it. Fandom is its own form of obsession, writes Derek Johnson, an obsession that can quickly become all-consuming as the fan's identity becomes little more than their fandom. So retaliating when that obsession is challenged by consuming one's object of fandom reads as oddly apt in a way. I kind of want to see a remake where someone eats Harry Styles.
The ending does complicate these more simplistic readings of Simone's consumption though, because Schmidt trusts the audience with a little more nuance than that. That'll be relevant in a second, I promise.
After killing and eating R, the film then ends with Simone disposing of his bones amidst a crowd of screaming fangirls, perhaps distinguishing herself as separate from them now that she has consumed him, shaving her head and going home, promising her fretting parents that she'll go back to school and that her lesson is learned. Complicating her motivations though, she then writes one last letter to the dead R, stating her persisting love for him and that he'll always be a part of her, and that she's missed her period. And, well, to quickly interject about periods with a film with very little nuance, Emerald Fennell Saltburn, a very bad film that I can't stop thinking about, also quite explicitly depicts the power dynamics between classes and genders amidst a turmoil of violence and obsessive consumption. In one of the images through the film, because this is truly just a film of images over anything else, Oliver Quick confronts the spoiled sister of his best friend and textually bulimic Venetia Catton, once again emphasising the politics of female eating without anything slightly interesting to say about it. He chastises her for not eating, tells her that she will eat at breakfast the next morning, and slides his fingers into her underwear, upon which he finds out and is told that she's on her period. Oliver doesn't mind though, saying,
"It's lucky for you, others, aren't they?"
Very subtle, I know, before sucking his fingers clean of her blood, smearing it down his face, and then feeding it back to her, before then eating her out. Talk about eat the rich. That combined with another image in this film, in which Oliver drinks best friend Felix's bathwater after he's ejaculated in it, it's normal. Watch a John Waters movie if this shocks you. Makes Saltburn quite explicitly about consumption, no? In the context of class dynamics, Oliver's excessive consumption of the cat and siblings, albeit just through the consumption of their, well, fluids, his desire to assert his power over them through the acts of eating, drinking, and implicitly cannibalistic and violent sex acts, connects the film well with the consumptive cannibal genre as a whole, as Oliver asserts himself as the predatory and consumptive other and the eventual ruler over Saltburn. Similarly, his obsession over Felix, his need to have some part of him no matter the cost, to the point of laying claim on, or, well, in his grave, associates the film well with the romantic cannibal genre and the themes of Der Fan 2, persisting love in spite of violence and exploitation. This makes me sound like I like Saltburn. I don't like Saltburn. Don't watch Saltburn. Watch a John Waters movie. Watch a John Waters movie. Der Fan's ending complicates the simplistic reading of Simone's consumption and suggests a more complex and nuanced approach to her purveying love for R. Despite him exploiting her and using her for his own sexual desires, she remains desirous of him, desires to always carry him with her, for him to be a part of her no matter what, emphasised even further by her potentially carrying R's child after killing him, thereby taking every part of him and assimilating him completely into herself. She has claimed R in a way no other woman will, asserting her power as his only lover while simultaneously reclaiming her power as a vulnerable woman over a powerful man.
Now, speaking of fandoms, and as a gender-neutral Tumblr girl for the last 12 or so years, I've got to say we've had this fascination with cannibalism as a romantic metaphor lately. Or at least my sides of Tumblr have been, the cool side, the perverts, the weirdos, the freaks. Positive.
I guess there's just two kinds of people, Miss Sandstone. My kind of people and assholes.
Whether that be all gay representation in media is problematic unless it directly involves cannibalism, I think that presenting cannibalism as a metaphor for intimacy was perhaps one of the greatest things we ever did as a society. The zeitgeist of Tumblr girls right now, the largely queer and female presence of Tumblr, at least my subsection of Tumblr, has found an underlying, deeply violent but very personal connection to the subject of cannibalism, of wanting someone so much that you want to devour them, or for them to devour you.
And of course, this isn't entirely unique to Tumblr. I've seen a few TikToks about the subject and was even part of a quite avid discussion that Twitter users were having with Richard Sykin, of all people, about cannibalism as a romantic metaphor, and I think he's on my side. I'm not too sure. But I mentioned Tumblr by way of sort of introducing Ethel Cain, because as a self-admitted Tumblr girl who just really excels on the platform, I think it's due in part to Preacher's Daughter that we have this collective fascination with romantic cannibalism. So let's get into it.
Preacher's Daughter is the concept album and first studio release by Hayden Anadonia, who performs under the stage name Ethel Cain.
Each song in the album tells the story of Ethel's life as the titular preacher's daughter, from young adolescence to the cusp of womanhood, though she doesn't quite reach it, with them all having the running narrative of her tumultuous relationship with her faith and her deceased father, the eponymous preacher we hear speaking in drones and sermons and televangelist gospel. We also learn of difficult romantic relationships that she had in her home state of Nebraska as she comes to relearn of sexual abuse at the hands of her father in the former half of the album, before running away from home in the latter half, road tripping across America, and meeting the man who would ultimately cause her grisly fate, the charming and explicitly cannibalistic Isaiah.
The album has been universally praised amongst critics and audiences, with Emma Garland describing Anhedonia's writing as some of the most fearless songwriting in recent memory, and Paul Bridgewater calling the album thematically a reckoning of salvation and oppression, all played out across the battlefield of religion and love. Interesting. Navigating the genres of country, goth pop, alt pop, dreamwave, and well, I'm not sure. I'm a movie person, not a music person. The album is, to me at least, a fantastic example of horror storytelling outside of the mainstream purview of what horror can be to most, depicting tragic romance and harrowing violence at its most gothic. Anhedonia is a big horror fan, citing films like The Blair Witch Project, The Taking of Deborah Logan, and Eraserhead as some of her key influences for creating horror and horror narratives, and I can certainly see why. Just listening to Preacher's Daughter brings about the sensorial experiences of watching a found footage or snuff movie specifically, of finding something that you shouldn't have, a memory restricted to a Polaroid in evidence. This is a sensation that permeates the entire album too, and not just the latter half, after Ethel meets the cannibalistic Isaiah. Even in the light-hearted American Teenager, for example, in which Ethel reflects on growing up as the American teenager, a song that for all intents and purposes sounds like any summer banger you'd hear on the radio, there's an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like something dark is looming underneath the surface, much like slasher and horror films in their establishing of a normative setting, a suburb, a neighbourhood, only for it to be the setting of brutal horror later on in the film.
In its runtime, the song not only emphasises the ultimate disillusion of the American dream, much like the earlier discussed Chainsaw, Pax Americana, and the America that exists in the consumptive cannibalism genre as a whole, and the quote-unquote honour of dying for one's country, but imbues the song with the ever-present threat of death and trauma that will permeate through the album. The album also includes a couple of ambient tracks, one of which, track 10, being titled August Underground, which scores Ethel's death after suffering through Isaiah's abuse. The title of this track references the controversial series of films directed by Fred Vogel, and alludes to the brutal depictions of violence the series is known for, and subsequent cannibalism in August Underground Mordom, while also hinting towards Ethel's unfortunate fate in the previous track. Additionally, this reference also connects the album to a lineage and knowledge of the horror genre at its very darkest, and positions the album as a kind of extreme in its own right. As has been said before, horror references horror, whether that be kids watching a slasher movie in the background of a sleepover, or nodding to the entire genre as a whole on a metatextual level. So, including a reference to the genre in which it occupies also establishes Preacher's Daughter as a distinct horror story, and an extremist one at that. Speaking of which, there's also a distinct knowledge of literary horror and literary violence represented through the album, one that invokes the fears of specifically gendered consumptive violence and cannibalism as it is represented through the Gothic and a few of my earlier discussed texts. Track number 9, Tolmia, is one that especially invokes these fears, with its title referencing the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, and the Descent into Hell, a story commonly, and perhaps incorrectly, adapted by more extreme iterations of the horror genre, the 1976 Pasolini film Salo being the one that springs to mind, which has its own interesting discussions about eating. It's a song that encapsulates the violence through the album, like the final act of a horror movie that you should have stopped watching, with the accompanying visualizer for the song feeling like something fresh out of a dark web Red Room type of video.
It's just grotesque in the best possible way, with the visceral descriptions of Isaiah's violence inflicted on Ethel reflecting those earlier discussed Gothic fears, and emphasising the power dynamic between the two to its very breaking point.
What fear a man like you brings upon a woman like me. Please don't look at me, she pleads as she dies, but there's nothing you can do. It's already been done. Goosebumps. And of course, reiterating the discussion of consumptive violence and boy cannibalism from Der Fan, the predilection of patriarchy to consume as a means of asserting power and dominion of those more vulnerable. Part of the raison d'etre of Preacher's Daughter for Anhedonia was in the reflection of how her continued practice of faith as a trans woman fits outside the purviews of heterocentric Christianity, a space often deemed as inhospitable for queer people. So, unsurprisingly, Preacher's Daughter has a lot to say about faith and religious trauma. For one, where biblically Isaiah is a prophet who arrives to redeem those of their sins, if we are to read Tolmia through this lens, the harrowing lines spoken by a benevolent benevolent God and death entwined. Blessed be you, girl, promised to me by a man who can only feel hatred and contempt towards you. I am no good nor evil. Simply I am, and I have come to take what is mine. We can infer that this iteration of Isaiah, and his pursuit of a perverse, divine, and cannibalistic punishment upon the pure treacherer Ethel, is redeeming nobody. Additionally, on this point, I think that the lyrics to Sun-Bleached Flies, what I wouldn't give to be in church this Sunday, listening to the choir so heartfelt, all singing, God loves you, but not enough to save you, really emphasises the traumatic rejection of faith from a queer perspective, as well as feeling the rejection of faith amidst violent and traumatic death, which is certainly comparable, no? Like queer people, cannibalism has always occupied an interesting space within religion and religious practice. I mean, what's a more significant memory for many Christians than eating and drinking the body and blood of Christ, enacting acts of cannibalism on who you deem to be your saviour? Indeed, as Peggy Reeves-Sande argues, cannibalism is never just about eating, but is primarily a medium for non-gustatory messages having to do with the maintenance, regeneration, and in some cases the foundation of the cultural order, once again asserting the ultimate conclusion of consumptive cannibalism, the assertion of power and power dynamics of those within the group, this specific group being puritanic patriarchy, as it often is, and the violent rejection of those outside of it.
I think it's also important to note that Ethel Cain follows a lineage of this kind of language from contemporary female artists too. And yes, I am sort of including this section for the Fiona Apple stans in my life.
And if you ain't Fiona Apple, I don't give a rat's ass!
Similarly to how Andrews contextualises cannibalism in the space of Gothic literature as being reflective on the metaphorical consumption of women by men, female artists tend to use this kind of consumptive language to reflect on subjects like codependent relationships, male entitlement, invisible labour, or, in the case of Holz's Jennifer's Body, a literal case of male on female violence. It's a kind of recontextualized consumption, a recontextualized exocannibalism, one that is as violent as the actual act, but more metaphorical in its delivery. I also just want to pay attention to a line in Alanis Morissette's You Ought to Know.
I hate to bug you in the middle of dinner, and are you thinking of me when you fuck her?
With its deliberate connection between eating and sex, two things that are generally associated with cannibalism, nodding back to the depravity of it and the violation of the human body, and also things that are historically heavily politicised against women.
Ethel Cain, following this consistent lineage of artists that came before her, not only establishes her storytelling in the space of horror narratives, but also establishes her as an artist creating in the genre, the elevated riot girl creating some of the most fearless songwriting in recent memory. In the climax of the album, after telling the story of his abuse in Tolmia and learning of her death in Sun-Bleached Flies, Isaiah kills and eats Ethel as a means to possess and own her body entirely and claim her as the dominant male in the story, one who ultimately triumphs over her abusive father, her other lovers, and over God themselves. Though in death and the afterlife, she sees it as a romantic gesture, romanticising the act in the final and most lovely track of the album, Strangers, it is still an act of profoundly invasive violence. The violence that is so often associated with the Gothic, and the metaphorical, if equatable violence experienced by women as a whole. While Isaiah does not perhaps extend the same love to Ethel she does to him, there's an intimately romantic finality of her claims of him as handsome when she's all over his mouth, her concerns of turning in his stomach and making him feel sick, and of course the final act of familial love that she extends to her mother in her death. Mama, just know that I love you, and I'll see you when you get here.
The tragic nature of Ethel's fate and her final message to her mother, a woman robbed of both her husband and daughter in the cyclical natures of generational and gendered violence, brings me well to my next and final case study, and the one that perhaps represents cannibalistic love at its very best.
Bones and All, written by David Kajanik and directed by Luca Guadagnino of Call Me By Your Name fame, and based on the novel by Camille De Angelis, was released in 2002 under Vision distribution in Italy and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Pictures in the United States. Set in the 1980s, the film follows teenage cannibal Marin, abandoned as a child by her mother and left to fend for herself by her father, as she embarks on a road trip across America, driven by her craving and the hopes of finding others like her. Along the way, after an encounter with a fellow eater, Sully, who encourages her not to ignore her cravings but unsettles her, she encounters Lee, a disenfranchised drifter with similar cannibalistic desires, and they form an unlikely and deeply romantic bond as they navigate their shared desires and the dangers it presents and confront their own traumatic pasts. Depicting a sleepy and almost subdued rendition of 80s Americana, touching romantic scenes between the teenage lovers, and the most exquisitely brutal violence and gore seen in horror for the year, Bones and All was generally well liked by critical audiences, despite its less than stellar box office return, with Justin Chang writing that there's a real pleasure in Bones and All, an insistent sweetness that somehow both nourishes and cleanses away the horror, and John Waters even placing it in his top films for 2022.
Now, as I'm sure you already know from this essay, other essays, and, well, my entire academic career, I am a big fan of combining horror and romance, so it's refreshing to see that Bones and All was always pitched as navigating that genre hybridity, despite how much that might have affected some of its critical response. Before it even came out, Guadagnino even spoke of the film as being a very romantic story, about the impossibility of love and yet the need for it, even in extreme circumstances. And truly, Bones and All presents us love at its very most extreme.
The queer is the taboo breaker, the monstrous, the uncanny, writes Sue Ellen Case. Like the Phantom of the Opera, another famously romantic horror text, the queer dwells underground, below the operatic overtones the dominant, frightening to look at, desiring, as it plays its own organ, producing its own music. While Marin and Lee stand as a heterosexual relationship, their clear desire for the same gender is well established throughout the film, extending past their sexual desires and into their cannibalistic desires. For one, referencing his sexuality in a tongue-in-cheek way, as we bisexuals are wont to do, Lee has a tattoo saying Adam plus Eve and Steve on his arm, associating the film well within a specifically queered religious context that's well associated with consumptive violence, as well as jabbing at the mantra, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, often used in homophobic Christian campaigns. Additionally, and as highlighted heavily in the trailers for the film, the story begins with Marin having an intimately romantic encounter with another girl in her school before biting off her finger, and later in the film, Lee picks up a guy at a carnival and has sex with him before killing and eating him with Marin.
I think John Waters summed it up best by asking, is there such a thing as a butch twink? Yes, there is, and Timothée Chalamet goes all Larry Clark on us here, a soft-trade hetero-cannibal who kills an evil closeted gay trick so he and his flesh-eating girlfriend can feed.
Jokes aside, the idea of the eminently bisexual cannibal is actually well associated with horror theory, specifically in the space of the eminently bisexual vampire.
No, vamp isn't for vampire, it's because he's bisexual.
To nod back to Alanis Morissette, eating and sex is often closely linked, so the figure of the bisexual eater is a somewhat common one in the vampire genre, as being equally desirous of any gender as both a fuck and as food. About the subject, Millie Williamson writes that the vampire is a subversive, borderline figure which problematizes representation and destabilizes the boundaries of gender. However, she ultimately emphasizes, with reference to Sue Ellen Case's writing on the subject, that the vampire disrupts because it exists within the boundaries which we conceive of being. The bipolarities that enclose the heterosexist notion of being are punctured, and new forms of being, or beings, are imagined through desire.
The queer vampire and the queer cannibal alike exist to challenge the binaries of consumptive and romantic cannibalism as a whole, and indeed challenges the binaries of my previously asserted girl and boy cannibalism too, troubling the politics of eating in a way that is defiantly and explicitly queer. Similarly, from Harry Benshoff, the queer suggests death over life by focusing on non-procreative sexual behaviours, and indeed no other quote probably encapsulates Bones and All more, as the two monstrous queers hide away in their countryside cottage to engage in cannibalistic behaviours that graphically violate the boundaries of death and life, and reject everything even close to normative and heterocentric. And there's a repulsive kind of beauty to that, like Hannibal and Will throwing each other off of the cliff in the finale of NBC's Hannibal, Andrew sleeping peacefully while he digests the meat of his dead lover in the novel Exquisite Corpse, Jennifer swinging both ways in her hungry desire for Needy, or the litany of codependent female werewolves and vampires that haunt queer cinema to this day. And if we were returned back to the Gothic, back to the queer cannibals in Melmoth the Wanderer, the subject of the queer cannibal, choosing death over life in an ultimate seeking of pleasure, has seemingly typified the romantic cannibal genre from the very beginning. Getting back to Bones and All, despite the violence that they inflict on others, Guadagnino claims the two are not manipulative or evil people, unlike other literary cannibals like Hannibal Lecter, or similarly pathological men in suits, as he calls them, nodding back to the idea of the cannibalistic upper-class other feeding on the working classes for the sake of their own pleasure. Instead, he describes them as more closely associated with animals, making the distinctions between sex and consumptive violence all the blurrier and, well, indistinct. Standing apart from the troubled Simone of Der Fan or the cannibalistic Isaiah of Preacher's Daughter, Marin and Lee are, for lack of a better phrase, born that way, and their cannibalistic urges are generative or institutionalised, passed down by their parents, much like the cycles of trauma are often passed down from parents to children. The poison drips through, to call back to Succession, a violence and proclivity towards it that they cannot be rid of no matter what they do. This is even represented on screen through the traumatic patricide of Lee's father, in which Lee kills and eats his father after he attempts to do the same to him and his sister, and Marin's mother being committed to a mental asylum after her birth out of fear of eating her own child, described in a letter to Marin that her mother would rather see her dead than as an eater. Through the lens of surviving trauma, the film consistently asserts that Marin and Lee aren't bad people for their cannibalistic impulses. They are simply what they are, two deeply traumatized queer kids just trying to survive in a society that rejects them at every turn.
Another significant and somewhat related facet of both Preacher's Daughter and Bones and All is their settings, rural America, especially when we consider what we earlier discussed about consumptive cannibalism and the desolate American landscape. Removing the institutional cannibal from the overseas and putting them much closer to home.
Different, albeit just as powerful, Bones and All is able to depict the spanning landscapes of rural America through wide-shot angles and hues of orange and brown, close-up depictions of slow grocery stores and diners, bright light carnivals and rusty gas pumps, America outside of the purviews of patriarchal capitalism where love can grow between the two teen lovers. Standing apart from the lush greens and oranges and the small towns of Italy in Call Me By Your Name, Guadagnino depicts an America that changes and shifts with his filmmaking, becoming as vast and as small as he needs it to. And he writes that, I hope this movie comes across as a very immersive journey into the landscape of America, instead of being a movie about it. It's gothic, but at its most pleasurable sublime, the subdued and sleepy stillness before everything goes wrong, just like American Teenager at the beginning of Preacher's Daughter, an America rife with trauma under the surface. It's interesting to connect these two depictions to what is depicted in, say, Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes, where the landscape encourages cannibalistic violence due to its vast loneliness and isolation from the rest of the world, away from patriarchal cannibalism and in a literal food desert where the most vulnerable cannot be helped, so much so that they are reduced down to others by the more metropolitan victims that they place on the butcher's block. Compared to those, the final and fatal acts of violence in both Bones and All and Preacher's Daughter take place in well-populated states like California or in suburbs and apartment buildings. In these texts specifically, the rural is where love can grow. The populated is where it is stamped out.
It feels tragic to reveal that Marin and Lee's story ends in bloodshed, as many cannibal stories do. That Sully stalks Marin after she and Lee try to make a normal life for themselves and attempts to lay claim on her, an old man with too much power and strength over a young girl. Despite his best efforts, and in a scene that brings to mind the bloodshed of New French Extremity, Lee loses too much blood after protecting Marin and dies in her arms, pleading with her that
I want you to eat me. I want you to eat. I want you to feed. No. I want you to eat.
No, I don't want
you to do it, Mary.
I can't stop.
I'm done here.
No.
I want you to do it, Mary.
As has been established in the queer and romantic horror that has come before it, the monster queer that Lee represents through the text cannot truly exist outside of the realm of his own creation, outside of the sleepy safety that he has created with Marin, and, as is intimately understood through the text, the act of consuming someone, Bones and All, is one associated with an intimate love and respect, and a sensation of ultimate euphoria and pleasure amongst the cannibals, and so Lee pleads for Marin to eat him, to love him and carry him always, so the world's pleasures would always be theirs to revel in.
An act of cannibalistic lust is primarily an act of love, a horrid yet harmonious union of subject and object, lover and beloved, writes Parker Flynn. And ultimately, both texts assert the truth behind the horrid harmony of cannibalistic love and lust. Anhedonia released the single Famous Last Words, an ode to eaters, while I was originally writing this script, which again inspires the sensorial experience of this final act of cannibalism even further. The horrid beauty of devouring the one you love the most, bones and all, and carrying them with you always.
And yes, she did post it on Tumblr with the caption, "Can't stop thinking about bones and all." So, I don't know about you, but me and Ethel Kane are psychically linked, I think. We're best friends. So, I've argued through this paper that cannibalism can be a figure of transcendence, an act of union and love, a utopian yearning for a lost unity and oneness, thereby bridging even the divide between eating and being eaten. I've spoken a lot through this essay about America, partly due to my case studies being American texts. But I feel like this specific citation is an important one, because the practice of cannibalism extends far beyond the West and into many different countries, cultures, and religions, which have been demonized and pathologized by texts like Cannibal Holocaust, where cannibalism is not seen exclusively as an act of violence, but indeed as an act of love, be that romantic, familial, or as respect for the dead. These are cultures which deserved respect outside the purview of a long overdone horror trope, and I'm glad that texts like Bones and All and Preacher's Daughter are able to examine this underexamined facet of romanticism and broaden our purviews about what is romantic and what is monstrous. And I can only hope that I've been able to perhaps shed a bit of light on this particularly meaty subject.
Hello all, and thank you for watching this video essay. As I said in the beginning, this has been in progress for over a year now, and a lot has changed, a lot has happened, and, well, I'm in the process of even more changes. But I'm working on making sure that those changes mean that I can focus some time on my channel again, make more essays for you guys, and get back to enjoying academia and the things that I love. If you'd like to check in on me between uploads, I'm on Twitter and Tumblr at VideoNasty, the same way it's spelled here. And yeah, that's all for now, everyone. Stay safe, stay sane, and remember to always stay spooky.